intro. Fantastic. Okay, are you good to go? I am. Yeah. Sure. Okay. Welcome everyone. Welcome panelists to the Oxford Forum for Questioning Extremism's first event in person this year. So the event is the data economy, privacy, regulation, and democratic threat. And we'll be discussing sort of how and why big tech sells our data, how social media platforms can be regulated more effectively to protect the privacy of users, and what effects unregulated platforms can have on democracies and societies around the world. So we'll be splitting the discussion into three sections in accordance with the three sort of main effects that big tech has when dealing with our data. So firstly, the political implications of how our data is used, how it can be used in, for example, to affect democracies and to organize political events. Secondly, the negligence of any sort of duty of care for individuals by big tech companies, so its effect on public health in general. And thirdly, the consumer's rights to their own data. So to what extent do we have control of our own privacy? How does us owning our data, like our own data, actually work? And yeah, that is the structure. So I am very pleased to welcome our three panelists, who I will shortly introduce. So firstly, we have James Ward, who is a privacy lawyer and data strategist. He is based at the Oxford Internet Institute, and his scholarship focuses on the interaction between legal structures, connected technologies, and human autonomy. He is also the founding and managing partner of Ward PLLC, which is a law firm and data strategy consultancy. So he advises clients on complex privacy and data protection requirements. He is also the author of Data Leverage, Unlocking the Surprising Growth Potential of Data Partnerships, which is a best-selling book on privacy and data strategy. And he's a certified fellow in information privacy. Warmest welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. Secondly, we have Dr. Elinor Carmi, who is a digital rights advocate, feminist, researcher, and journalist. So she works, writes, and teaches on internet standards, digital literacy, sound studies, and internet governance. Her second monograph, Media Distortions, Understanding the Power Behind Spam, Noise, and Other Deviant Media, focuses on the politics behind digital categories we take for granted, for example, spam and noise. She is currently working on the Nuffield Foundation project, developing a minimum digital living standard, and the POST Parliamentary Academic Fellowship, working with the UK's Digital, Culture, Media and Sport Committee on the project she proposed, Digital Literacies for a Healthy Democracy. Thank you for coming today, Eleanor. And last but of course not least, we have Dr. Rubin Vins, who is an associate professor of human-centered computing, working between computer science, law, and philosophy. He focuses on data protection, machine learning, and regulation of and by technology. From 2018 to 2020, he was a postdoctorate research fellow in artificial intelligence at the Information Commissioner's Office, addressing artificial intelligence, machine learning, and data protection. He joined the Department of Computer Science at Oxford as a postdoctoral researcher in 2015, and he gained his PhD in web science that same year. Welcome everyone, and thank you for coming today. So firstly, to start off, I'm going to give each speaker some time to explain their work and kind of give a quick introduction, anything you feel I've missed, perhaps, starting with James.
Well, it was a very comprehensive biography. So I'm very happy to be here with you tonight. I would say that the work that I do is sort of bifurcated. There's a component of my work that is aimed at the private sector and building data products, data productization strategies, and compliance regimes that simultaneously respect the rights of individuals and respect the rights of privacy, not only for individuals, but for communities. And also allow for growth and meaningful production of a success for the company. And the other side of the work is the sort of compliance, thoughtful critical, often very pessimistic analysis of the way that legal regimes are not necessarily drafted, but the way that they affect the real world. And I think I'm very excited to hear from my co-panelists tonight, largely because their work covers so comprehensively these areas that I'm very interested in. So it's a great pleasure to be here with you tonight.
Thank you very much. Eleanor?
Hi, everyone. I'm sorry I couldn't be there, but I unfortunately have COVID after 2 years. I managed to avoid it, but it's caught in me. And yeah, I guess in a nutshell, I'm very interested in two main research areas. One of them is kind of the politics of what's happening in the back end of our screen, and sort of to demystify a lot of discourses that both legal scholars and sort of legal texts tell us, but also computer scientists tell us that is the truth and this is the only way that things can happen. And in my book, Media Distortions, that's basically what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to demystify a lot of things around how we understand web cookies, how we understand things that, social media companies tell us that are organic, and all of these kind of things, and show the politics behind that. And then the other side of what I'm interested in, how does that affect how we engage and understand media and communication and the environment around us? And that relates to my work around data literacies, where I'm trying to understand how these kind of interfaces, how these kind of laws, how these kind of things that we use every day, how does that affect, what we can do, but also what we can demand as citizens in democratic societies? So I'm very excited to be here with two very esteemed scholars who are doing really great research. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you very much. And lastly, Rubin.
Hi, thanks for having me. And sorry I couldn't be there in person. I don't have a positive test like Eleanor, but I am concerned that I might have COVID or at least some sort of bug. So apologies for that. But yeah, just to give some background on my research, I suppose, and broader professional career to date, I suppose I've always been kind of at the intersection of computer science and kind of legal and policy, regulatory, I guess political issues as well. Mostly, I suppose my work is focused on a few different areas, one being the kind of third-party tracking economy. So looking at websites and apps and looking at the different entities that they send data to, your data when you visit them and when you use them. So this can range from anything from behavioral data about what you do on those sites and on different sites, and combine to target adverts to you, or to assess your credit worthiness, or to decide whether you might be a bot or a real human. These are all different purposes for these third-party tracking networks. And so a lot of my work has been looking into that sort of empirical work, trying to download millions of apps and study where they send data to. And then the other side of my work has been kind of looking at the intersection of machine learning and the law. So one aspect of that being data protection, looking at how data protection and machine learning intersect, and the kinds of obligations that companies that are developing ML and AI might need to be paying attention to, the kinds of rights that that individuals and groups might be able to use to resist or to challenge these systems, both from data protection law, but also from non-discrimination law and other areas as well. So that's kind of the two sort of main areas that I've looked at in my research. And just sort of in addition, for a while I was working at the ICO, which is the Information Commissioner's Office, which is the UK data protection regulator. So through that, I got very interested in more broadly in how regulators use technology and how they regulate technology. So that's another area of interest of mine.
Thank you very much. That's all very interesting and great to know about your work in more detail. So let's jump right in. Firstly, on the first topic of political polarization, As you probably all will know, Facebook/Meta has had a year of pretty bad press in 2021. So it started off with allegations that they were involved in the Capitol riots on the 6th of January. They have come under fire for lax regulations and not having tightened them enough in order to prevent this event having been planned. So my first question would be, Eleanor, how do social media companies' lack of data protection lead to these incidents of increasingly sectarian violence?
I mean, I think first of all, I want to complicate the question around what is politics, because for me, politics is much larger than politics with a big P. And feminists have been arguing for a long time that the personal is also political. So I don't conceive of the stuff that we saw at the Capitol as the only instance of political influences that Facebook has over our lives. But I think what we are seeing is on every aspect of our lives. First of all, I think one of the most worrying one is this kind of notion that surveillance is okay, because that is the business model of these social media companies, and they are trying to normalize it as if this is okay. And we've had, in our project, me and my big data, developing citizens' data literacies, one of the things that we asked people was two things. We asked a lot of things, but two questions that kind of struck to us. So one of them was, do you like personalized experience on social media? And I think 60% said that they are okay with that. And then when we asked them if they are okay with companies tracking their behaviors over time, 95% of people said that they're not okay with that. But the majority of people can't really connect between the two because they don't really understand how these companies work. Now, this was an ongoing process and lobbying campaigns of Digital Advertising Association that wanted to conceal what's happening in the back end of our screen. So I really feel that when we're talking about politics, we're talking about a whole taking over about our experience and how we understand how we can use these technologies. And that for me is political. It's political that I don't know what's happening to my data. It's political that, some actions are visible while some actions are not visible. And that constructs what I understand as sociality. So again, I really want to emphasize that I know that it's really easy to sort of get stuck with politics with a big P, but I think the everyday consequences of these social media companies, we see that on every aspect, right? We know that all of the influencers and all of this kind of women that want to or people that are following, all the likes and all of this kind of metrics that are starting to be a value of how you're worth and stuff like that. But also at the same time, what's happening in the back end that a lot of us are not familiarized with. So again, I just really want to emphasize that politics is our everyday life and not only politics with a big P. And going back to your question about the lack of of legal frameworks, I think the legal frameworks that we have today have massively failed. I think that the GDPR was a good step forward, and obviously it's kind of this a good example to a lot of other countries such as the US, but ultimately the GDPR has not proven itself to be a successful mechanism. As a citizen, there's very few people who can actually know how to use these mechanisms. When we asked in our research people what is data, the majority of people didn't even know what is data. So how can I exercise my citizen right if I don't even understand the basic things in order to do that? Now, not all of us are Max Schrems who have very persistently chased Facebook and sued them and have done incredible work. Not all of us have the resources, the time, the energy, and honestly, I have no idea how he still manages to persist that. But what that shows us is that very few people actually have the ability to challenge the way that social media are operating with the existing mechanisms that are available to us. And I'm gonna end because I can talk about this forever. I'll give the stage to my colleagues.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Yeah, you mentioned sort of how the algorithm works and how people like to see stuff which is related to their own interests and stuff like that. but not to veer it back to politics with a big P, but I would be really interested to hear about this. How can this sort of lack of data protection and these algorithms being changed and shifted be exploited and manipulated by politicians? For example, the Cambridge Analytica scandal in 2016 American elections with Ted Cruz and Donald Trump. I'm sort of going to direct this towards Rubin.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question. I think for me, that particular example of Cambridge Analytica is not one where I'm totally convinced that they had that much of an effect in reality. I think the fact that they were able to gather the data that they did in the ways that they did and to sell their services around the world, not just in the US, but around the world in some very much more, concerning kinds of services that they offered in various countries in the global south. That is all very worrying and concerning. I think whether they actually influenced the US election that much, I'm not so sure. But certainly, the lack of oversight of this stuff happening on Facebook is very worrying as well. So yeah, I think the bigger picture, though, the bigger picture is that the kind of thing that they were trying to do perhaps is possible, and that's what's really concerning for the future. And the fact that there's the platform that is facilitating all of this is basically there to turn a profit. It's there to do the minimum that it can to get away with what it's doing in terms of regulating what's going on the platform. It's completely unclear about how to resolve different jurisdictional problems where you've got countries with different standards around what's hate speech, countries with completely different political systems, completely different culture and history, which Facebook as a US based global corporation doesn't have the expertise or the wherewithal or really the incentive as a kind of corporation to deal with. And so often you hear them saying, well, if we have to hire all the content moderators that we'd need to hire to stop the next genocide in wherever it is next after Myanmar, then we wouldn't be able to afford to put Facebook into that country because the ad revenue we get from it isn't enough. That is kind of put out as a threat, but I would say that would maybe be a really good thing if if Facebook had to withdraw from certain countries because it couldn't afford to run itself responsibly. Maybe that would be a good thing. Maybe there'd be room for other kinds of platforms, of other ways of communicating with each other over the internet that might be better, that could develop elsewhere. So yeah, that's my opinionated take on that question.
Yeah, wonderful. And kind of on that note, how Facebook is sometimes perhaps not able to kind of regulate things in certain countries and how jurisdictions vary between countries. James, how much of the issue do you think lies in inherent moderation difficulty, sort of that Rubin was describing, as opposed to deliberate malpractice, as whistleblowers were trying to expose that Facebook was being deliberately negligent as opposed to trying to moderate, but instead just having difficulties with that?
Sure. I hope I don't clear the room when I admit this, but I was a trial lawyer for 10 years before I became a privacy lawyer. And in that time, one of the things that I did was I was private counsel for the US government when we sued the big banks for the mortgage-backed securities cases. So RBS, Goldman Sachs. And in the course of that work, I got to read all of their emails. I got to read what these bankers were saying. And they were literally saying to each other, this guy's got a 520 credit score and makes $20,000 a year. Let's underwrite $1 million loan. As though no one would ever read that. I mean, I know it's a lawyer's trope to think that everything you ever put in writing will be read, but it will. So there is absolutely that kind of malfeasance at some of the platforms. And I think the Hagen testimony made that clear. There's absolutely a decisional process, and then more importantly, a corporate cultural process at these companies that emphasizes the value of an individual data set, an individual data subject as fodder for the creation of revenue for the company. It's actually kind of a stupid way of looking at it, because an individual data subject's data is not particularly valuable. It's only in thinking about individuals as a part of a cohort that you really start to make sense out of it. So it's not this atomized subjective, it's in the collective that we start to get insights. But they've made so much money, they've adopted a view of the world that says, let's pull in all of the information we can about everyone at all times, because that's what our business model is. But no one understands the business model of these companies anyway. The people who are making these decisions, the content moderators, have absolutely no time to make a reasoned choice. And they're certainly not given the tools or the resources necessary to take care of themselves, let alone come up with a reasoned answer to a particular problem of moderating whether this is hate speech or not. These are complicated, nuanced, often legal questions about what should stay and what should go. But if we're talking about content moderation as a good faith attempt to keep what's harmful off the network, we've already missed the boat. That's not what's going on here. What's being done is the absolute bare minimum to keep the regulators from knocking on the door, to keep antipathy in Congress from getting to a point where Congress will actually act, when in fact Congress's primary purpose is to just do that. It's to be together in the same place. So I think there is certainly a degree of malfeasance. I think there is certainly a degree, I don't know about negligence, because it's a term of art, right? But it's something that I want to come to a little bit later. But I will say that there is a concerted choice to minimize the value and the resources dedicated to content moderations. And if you read something like Behind the Screens, to give an insight to what it's like to be a content moderator, there's an entire other species of claim against these companies for the way that they treat their content moderators. And where you put your money and your resources, that's where your values are. And I think we've gotten a pretty clear explanation of where the values lie.
Thank you, that's very eye-opening. Talking of this sort of moderation and how much of it's done by content moderators and how much of it's kind of automatic. Eleanor, how are fake accounts and spam being used to disseminate sort of political propaganda or even misinformation? And is the way that these accounts are detected as spam kind of foolproof? Do people have issues with that, kind of with the detection of spam?
Again, I obviously don't have the exact numbers, and I think nobody really has, including Facebook. It's very clear that people across the world are using, especially political leaders, are using. I am originally from Israel, and Benjamin Netanyahu has been accused of hiring different kind of bots, both on Facebook and on Twitter, to amplify him and also to seed hate and, to create propaganda around different kind of oppositions. And, I think it's a bit difficult to understand, but I think it's also important to remember that Facebook is not only enabling these kind of practices, but it's also trying to sort of make different kind of advertising practices not available. So if you're an advertiser and if you want to do different kind of things that would, create repetition or different kind of things like that, then that would be a problem. So as part of my research, what I show in my book, for example, is that, you have the legal way of doing the bots, right? That you have like this kind of that you can have amplify your page. And I think there was this guy in 2014 that showed he had like a page where he was doing the legal way through Facebook and to amplify his page to have more likes. And he started to see that there are, these kind of fake likes around that. So I think it's important to understand that when we're talking about bots and all of these kind of fake users and all of these kind of PR companies that are now much more widespread. We're not only talking about politics, it also happens in the kind of commercial area where, you know, you have different kind of celebrities that are buying different kind of fake likes and are trying to amplify and trying to create different kind of images. And obviously that is very problematic. But again, I think it's really difficult to understand what is the actual magnitude, because again, there's so much that we don't understand is happening on Facebook. And unfortunately, we have to wait every time until a different kind of whistleblower exposes that. However, a lot of academics have been saying what these whistleblowers been saying lately. And it's really important to emphasize that most of the stuff that Frances Haugen was saying is stuff that academics have been saying for more than a decade. And it would really be great if journalists and, you know, people in the legal systems and, you know, policymakers and governments would actually start to listen to us. They're very welcome to come to our conferences. And, you know, I think obviously there needs to be more dialogue, but a lot of the stuff that they have exposed is, you know, has been going on and academics have been arguing for a really long time. So I think that there needs to be a better connection between these communities so that we can, you know, surface these things. But I think the bigger question is, you know, we have all of these expose, we have all of these whistleblowers. What's happening after that? I think, you know, the countries are moving slow and, you know, breaking things, and these companies are moving fast and breaking things. So at the moment, it feels a bit like, you know, the kind of repercussions and kind of consequences of these things, we're not really seeing, I think, appropriate measures taking place. And I think, you know, obviously as democratic society, these things take time, right? And if you want to pass a law like the GDPR, it took, I don't know how many drafts, it took like 5 years just to make it, you know, as a law. And then even after that, you know, how do you actually apply that and all of that? These things take time, and, you know, a lot of the times that's a good thing, but unfortunately, because it moves so slow, that means that already the GDPR, I think, is irrelevant, and a lot of the stuff that's written there is really not appropriate to the way that social media are functioning. So I think this connection of how these companies are operating with kind of legal instruments are available, there is kind of a mismatch.
Thank you very much. And so to slightly kind of change tack so not anymore focusing on more like political aspects and how it can affect, how Facebook affects general dialogue, more focusing on sort of the individual impact on users of these social media platforms. So not necessarily only Facebook/Meta, but also, for example, YouTube, Twitter. I'd be interested to know, James, do you believe that big tech has tried to sort of encourage the unhealthy overuse of social media to boost the data economy due to the kind of quantification of attention that which we've been seeing lately?
Sure. In the same way that tobacco
Obvious
companies,
question, maybe,
in the same way that tobacco companies used to have doctors come on television in the 50s and say, this is going to be great for your lungs. Yeah. There is no question that an encouragement of greater consumption is directly in the perceived self-interest of these companies. But there is a hierarchy of problem here. And shockingly, Meta sits on top of it, which is probably the only time that their name is appropriate. The idea is that Meta has created a stream of information based on user activity online, but it's not really what you're doing on Facebook that matters. It's not really what you're doing on Instagram that matters. That's valuable, to be sure, because what Facebook is really good at is segmenting audiences and figuring out, based on how you engage with their content, what you like. That's why when you're talking about something and all of a sudden there's an ad for it on Instagram, there's been no evidence that they're actually listening to you. It's much worse. It's that the algorithm has become so accurate in predicting what you're going to do or talk about that it's actually able to respond to your behavior in real time. These predictive models are extraordinarily capable. And I'll give you an insight into why. Right now, Amazon has openings for data scientists. How many data scientist openings do you think Amazon has open right now that they're advertising for? Just a guess.
10,000.
10,000. My God, you're good. Yes, everybody always lowballs me, and I'm like, oh, here comes the 10,000. Yes, 10,000. 10,000 data scientists right now to be available at Amazon. They're using the data sets that they have to power the algorithms that make these decisions. But it's not what you're doing on Instagram, it's what you're doing on every other site that matters. Because Facebook's real data ingestion tool are pixels. It's the Facebook pixel and beacon that's on every website that you go to. They have pixeled the entire world. And I mean that literally, because those beacons are tied to beacon identifying tokens in physical locations, real world locations that will be able to ping and access your device to know where you are in real time. Facebook is trying to solve the proverbial last mile problem of knowing where a consumer is going to be and predicting it with such closeness that they can deliver the best ad at the last, at the last possible second when you're down the phone. So yeah, they've done that. And that's what the metaverse is about, right? It's creating a space where literally everything that you do is fodder for analytics that will drive you towards seeing an ad. But now they've solved the first and the last mile problem, because they control both the space, even though it's not really a space, and they control access to and understanding of everything that you do within it. So, to the extent that we're worried about what these companies are doing, and if we're going to target one to start with first, I think the answer is that we start with Facebook.
Yeah, no, that's really intriguing actually. And I was also personally wondering about whether they listened to what I was saying, because I got some very appropriate adverts on my
Instagram. They might do. I'm not going to say they're not doing it.
Yeah, I was very tempted to ask that as a question to one of you, but I didn't in the end. Might make me look a bit technologically unaware. But so kind of a bit of a change of subject slightly. So Rubin, what has been the role of social media in sort of the COVID-19 pandemic? So especially how it's affected perhaps vaccine hesitancy and the rise in unapproved treatments, and is enough being done to regulate this sort of misinformation, which could affect individual people, just as this sort of manipulation of data could do so as well?
I'm going to be really honest and say I don't know. It's not my area of research. Just personally, I suppose I've been quite fascinated to see which of my friends and family have, sorry, my cat's meowing here, to see who's been sort of going down certain routes of information and who hasn't. It hasn't always been what I would have predicted, but I can't say I'm sort of qualified to speak on that much. If I suppose what I might say is that if I were if I was an anti-vaccine advocate or conspiracy theorist, depending on your view of it, I can imagine that the infrastructure that we have in place is very well suited to identifying potentially sympathetic people to my cause, both on platforms like Facebook, but also more broadly the wider ad tech ecosystem, which is what we've been talking about. That Facebook have their own ad network that's got the pixels everywhere, but there's also other ad networks that are operating in this space that are sending data about you and what the websites you've looked at, what search terms you've used, where in the world you are, to literally hundreds, thousands of different companies every time you load a web page. And so that data is going to all those places, and it's all just so that one entity can bid to place an ad there. But in the process of doing that, there are hundreds of other entities that get access to that data. And so if I was trying to create the world's largest kind of list of potential allies in my campaign against COVID vaccines, I can definitely imagine how that infrastructure could be used for those purposes. And that's why I think I don't know what the solution is to like vaccine hesitancy, or whether that solution is the right way to think about it. But I certainly do think we need to regulate the ad tech space, because it creates these platforms for shaping people's information environments in ways that are profoundly dangerous. And whether it's hundreds of small cowboy outfits doing it, or large platforms doing it, or states doing it, they all have their own dangers and risks. And so, I'm in favor of just drastically taking apart some of that infrastructure.
Yeah, that's very relevant, and definitely you give yourself more less credit than you're due with that answer, which is very detailed. But yeah, so coming back to these whistleblowers, possibly for the last time today. So they kind of exposed, as you were saying, academics have kind of been looking into similar issues before that, but they brought to kind of worldwide attention that Facebook had been researching a negative impact of its platform on young girls, and in specific on their health, and how these sort of echo chambers have been created around perhaps eating disorder communities, in inverted commas, and they have kind of not done anything to regulate this. So Eleanor, would you agree that that companies like Meta prioritize profit over safety, and that there's sort of a people are being treated as kind of commodities here, and there should be a duty of care or not, basically? Yeah.
So, I mean, I think the obvious answer is, of course. I think Facebook has proven throughout the year that money is the only thing that interests them, and various people who have worked for Facebook and no longer work there have proven that. I also want to really emphasize a lot of stuff that hasn't been said. I think a lot of the stuff we're very preoccupied with ads, but I think it's very important to remember that Facebook conducts experiments on us on a daily basis, right? So from the contagion experiment that I think was exposed in 2014, 2 years ago, we saw a New York Times writer was saying that they wanted, so what happens on Facebook at the moment is that less and less people actually post stuff. What happens is that in order to encourage us to do that, they do that in several ways. One of them, and that experiment that was written in the New York Times, was that they want to show us more positive things that are good for the world, whatever that may mean. So they did an experiment where they took away negative things in order to encourage people to come more frequently on Facebook. Now, this is just one example of hundreds and thousands of experiments that are done on us that we are not even aware of. Now, if I want to do an experiment, I have to go through an ethics board in academia. I have to go through a lot of process if I want to do any experiment. Even my students, third year BA students, I'm sure that you guys as well, you have to go through ethics boards if you want to do experiments on people. However, Facebook is using us and doing all of these experiments without any oversight. And that, to me, is a huge problem. Now, what you were saying about the girls, the other problem that happens is that because fewer people are contributing in terms of actual posts, that means that extreme kind of views are amplified more. In our research, when we asked, people, how often do you post stuff? We found out that actually the majority of people are what I like to call silent participant, which means that they are going online, they can maybe, click like Rubin, he doesn't go into like vaccine wars or stuff like that. That means that the kind of discussions that are left on social media are the extreme views, but actually the amount of people who are saying that and are contributing to that are the minority. And, different kind of researchers have been proving for many years. There was, I think, research published a week ago, again on Facebook, that the majority of people are not sharing posts. So we're seeing several things. One of them is multiple experiments on us that we are not aware of that have shaped and influenced the way that we experience and understand. If Facebook is taking away negative things, whatever that may be, in order for me to see only positive things, what does that mean? Does it take away political stuff? Does that mean that if I'm going to go in the next few days on Facebook, I'm not going to see stuff about Ukraine and Russia because it's going to make me depressed and I'm not going to go on Facebook? This has really huge repercussion on how we understand ourselves, how we understand politics, but also how we understand our society, our friends, and things like that. So I want to emphasize that, you know, a lot of the things that we're talking about is maybe extremism in politics, or maybe, you know, stuff around what girls that are, you know, seeing anorexic material, which is extremely important. But there's a lot of other experiments that are done on us that are not accounted for, that are not done through any kind of ethics board or committee. And this is extremely flawed, and this has to stop.
Perhaps a similar thing to that, but less related to public health and more related to kind of consumer data rights. So obviously now Meta, since it's so dominant, has such a lot of access to our personal data with the uncanny algorithm and the data harvesting scandals. As many of you probably know, the name change of Meta was prompted after this year of bad press, and it's in reference to the new virtual reality metaverse project. Now, Rubin, what effect will this new sort of virtual reality system have on users' privacy? So I saw that, of course, it's a virtual reality thing. So you have your goggles, and it's like a virtual world. I've seen things that say it's like an EEG, like electroencephalogram, and can like test your brain waves. So is this something that we have to worry about, or not?
I have to admit, I'm sort of hoping that all the hype will die down soon, but maybe that's me being overly optimistic. I sort of don't want to have to think about it, but obviously, you know, it's part of my job to think about it, so I have to. But I suppose the impact on privacy, I mean, it's certainly trying to create a closed world where it becomes easier to capture all the data of everything you're doing and lock you into various, lock you into the platform in various ways. Not to mention just in terms of having to buy, you know, hardware so that you can participate in a work meeting. Having to probably move your desk around so that you can move around in the virtual space. I mean, I don't know if you watched the sort of Zuckerberg video of the metaverse. I watched that and I didn't understand what it was or how it worked or whether they were in the metaverse or not. And there was a video of people playing virtual table tennis, but then they were playing real table tennis. But then it was like, what are they in the virtual world now, or is it augmented reality? I couldn't figure out what was going on. Of course, none of this is actually that new, because in terms of people setting up shops in the metaverse or workplaces in the metaverse, we had this with Second Life a long time ago, perhaps too long for some people to remember, but there were university campuses were setting up campuses in this virtual world called Second Life. People were selling, virtual t-shirts in Second Life, and there was virtual money. Before Bitcoin, there was what's it called, Linden dollars, something like that, which was the currency within. They
not do it on Roblox as well, sort of Roblox University, but
right, yeah. So it's not, and they're all, there are interesting sort of legal questions that arise from that. I'm just still skeptical that, I think we're already pretty fully immersed in various internet services already, and changing the modality to being virtual reality, I think there's probably some entertainment value in that. I don't know if it's enough to sort of save Facebook's fortunes. They don't have a foothold in the infrastructure of our digital environment in the same way that Apple and Android and Microsoft and Amazon do. So Microsoft have a monopoly on Office software. Apple are in our pockets, a physical device that's in our pockets, or our laptops, and that gives them a foothold in our lives. Google have a foothold in sort of having a copy of everything that's on the web anywhere, indexing it, organizing it, and they also have Android, and they also have all kinds of other services that we rely on, like maps. So they have a foothold that way. Amazon run the majority of all of the cloud computing services that we rely on, or the data centers that we rely on. So Facebook doesn't have a really sort of concrete foothold in that way. And so I think the metaverse is kind of a last-ditch attempt to try and get some kind of foothold into the future. And I'm sort of hoping it fails, but I may be wrong.
Yeah, we'll see about that. You mentioned Apple, which is appropriate because Apple in 2021 was also in disputes with Meta. So they sort of introduced this new thing where they asked users of iPhones if they want Facebook or any other app to track their activity across other companies' websites or not. And Facebook objected to this because they were saying Apple was doing so to kind of self-preference their own services and targeted advertising products, in their words. And they said that this feature would negatively impact small businesses using Facebook to advertise. So with this in mind, this like button that we effectively press to consent to having our data used, is there actually such a thing as digital consent, James?
So consent is in many respects the least favored of the forms of lawful bases for processing under GDPR. And from a practical and operational perspective for companies, it should be, because actual consent should be able to be withdrawn at any time. And if it's withdrawn, you need to stop immediately, which means you need to have the processes and the systems in place to manage not only the receipt of the withdrawal of consent, but the immediate cessation of processing. Nobody has that. Nobody can do that. At best, you can control the way that people consent to cookies on a website. But even that is something that's not done particularly well, as lawsuits and decisions from the data protection authorities in France and elsewhere in the last 6 months have shown. So can you have consent? You'd need a structured and layered approach that says, have I identified for this person, contextually speaking, whether or not they understand what they're agreeing to, and that they have the right to change their mind, and that what the subsequent types of consent there could be are. And the more permutations to that equation, the further removed you get from there being meaningful consent. And this is an inversion of what we're all used to on the internet, which is by existing, you agree to our terms and conditions. And the reason why that's worked is it's been lawful in America for long enough, and the internet sort of grew up around the legal frameworks for access to websites in the US. We're moving away from that in Europe, but not in the United States. The FTC hasn't taken any steps to make consent more meaningful. It's really still the question of whether or not you're lying. And this is where we get back to the point that we were getting at before about the duty of care and whether or not what you've done is negligent. Negligent for businesses often means, have you fallen so far below the standard of care that another reasonable business would, that an average consumer, regardless of what they agreed to, would expect you to do better than that. And this is the one way that the very, very pro-business approach that the Supreme Court in the US and the Congress have taken could potentially be leveraged against them. So rather than thinking about a consent framework, because it's law in the US from the Supreme Court, AT&T versus Conception 2010, that consent is basically a nonsense now online. So the only way to really go after it is from this perspective of, are companies behaving in a way that an average reasonable consumer would never believe it possible? And there's some fruitful ground to be trod there. It's just a question of whether or not you can get there fast enough before the companies change their practices.
Yeah, it's very interesting to know. So in order for citizens to understand technology regulation, they're first required to understand the technology which is being regulated. But if a citizen can't understand their digital and privacy rights, then they can't vindicate them. So Eleanor, how might we formulate tech regulation so that citizens can understand it?
I think that's a really good question. I think it's, going back to the question on consent, which if I can sort of shamelessly promote my article around feminist critique to digital consent, which is open access and you can check it online. I basically disagree that we can give appropriate digital consent because, again, we don't really understand, the majority of people don't really understand what is data. If you don't even understand what is data, how can you understand that? And unfortunately, trying to think about the reasonable person and the kind of the average person is problematic because there are people who have different kind of digital literacies. Some people understand more than the others. And so at the moment, we're given this kind of one type of consent. And that is very problematic for people who come from different backgrounds. And it's usually people who come from poor backgrounds, both socioeconomic and both educational, that for them, this kind of consent mechanism doesn't make sense because they don't understand. The majority of people still don't understand that Facebook and Google make their money from advertising. So, you know, it's quite, I think, problematic. And I think this is a really great question about how can we create mechanisms that people can, you know, engage in a meaningful way. I think first of all is to understand that meaningful is different. It means different things for different people. And so trying to tailor different types of experiences and different types of these kind of engagement will be key to that. Instead of thinking of this kind of universal user or this kind of average person, we have to realize that people have different needs and we have to tailor that towards them. And, you know, and I think at the moment it's quite difficult. I don't really know. It will have to come, you know, laws are not separated from education. And at the moment, the education systems that we have are not appropriate. And, you know, even though young people think that they're digitally natives, what we show in our project is that actually that's not true. And that actually, even if you're young, if you come from poorer backgrounds, you would still not understand what's happening online, even more than people who come from richer backgrounds. So again, trying to think about, instead of this kind of ideal user and one type of user, that there are different types of users, and also that we need to combine that with education. Now, one of my main issues is, and one of the main things that we argue in our project, is that at the moment, citizens have very little instruments and are not really being taught what can they actually do with their data. Can I object? Can I contest? Can I challenge? And, you know, when people are being taught, they're only taught about you can consent or not in the consumer kind of framework, but they're not really being taught what are their citizens' options. What can I actually do? Can I mobilize the data that I have? Can I do a class action? What can I actually do with that? And to me, if you're not teaching citizens how to use your rights in order to negate, to challenge, and to do all of these things, then what's the point? If we're just educating people to be good consumers, if I'm, you know, gonna press okay or not okay, and that's pretty much it, that doesn't really educate us to be functioning, you know, in a democratic society and having agency about our future and what can we actually do with these companies. I think at the moment there is this notion that we're only here to consent. We're just kind of consent machines, right? I'm just consent, no consent. What can I actually do? And the majority of people have no idea about that. When we ask people, you know, what are the kind of things that you can do with your data? Nobody had even the glimpse of idea, how can they actually mobilize the affordances that they have and the laws that exist already to their advantage and to their community advantage. They were also talking in this kind of, oh, if I don't understand that, then it's my responsibility, this kind of individual responsibility, rather than it's actually society and my government that is not providing me with the appropriate means and the appropriate education to contest, to negate, to challenge, and to object to the kind of things that are happening. So I think your question is really great. I don't have the answer for that right now, unfortunately, but I think a lot of activists and a lot of educators are trying to work in these spaces in order to at least provide people with the minimum data literacies in order to understand what's happening to their data.
Thank you very much. So before I open the floor up to questions, I'll ask one quick question at the end, which any of you can pick up. But so as people who work with technology and in data protection, are there any steps that you take to protect your privacy online that we might not know about? Anything that you would recommend us doing on social media in particular to protect our privacy? I'll maybe direct it towards James first, just in case, if you have anything in particular.
You know, as a matter of fact, I do. All of the problems that we've identified today are systemic. And all of the problems that we've identified today are not going to go away as long as the existing platforms exist, because their business models demand that they continue to exist this way. So a group of colleagues of mine began a project about a year and a half ago to see if there was an alternative to create a social network that functioned differently, that did compromise personal data, that didn't spy on you, that didn't use your information effectively as a bludgeon against you. And after a great deal of research, we've concluded that you can, that the productization path doesn't have to be exploitative in the same way, that the experience can be tailored, and that the data becomes actually a feedback tool for the individual data subject and not for external sources. So that's the way that I'm protecting social media is we're building a new social network called Bright. And the idea is that it will focus on delivering the promise of what social media was supposed to be all along. So it's sort of taking up the Shoshana Zuboff challenge at the end of Age of Surveillance Capitalism and saying, you know, is there another way? I think there is. And we're, you know, it's a given the name, it shouldn't be surprising. It's a source of, you know, excitement and hope for us, but it's something that we think is vital work. And I think that's the sort of the challenge that's before us right now.
Is there anything that either Rubin or Eleanor want to contribute before I ask any open floor to questions? No? Okay.
I mean, I just want to say I use Signal, and in my family, we use the method of blackmail for persuading our family to join there as well. So whatever works for you. No, I'm kidding. I think it's really difficult, you know, and it's very individual. And I think it's a privilege to be able to completely disconnect. Everybody says, oh, I'm just not going to have a Facebook account and that's going to solve it. But, you know, actually Facebook spies on you even if you don't have an account. So that doesn't really matter. But, you know, I think that you can do minor steps, whatever works for you. I don't think, you know, there's no like one type of solution. If you can use systems that are more privacy friendly, you know, I moved into Brave, which is a more privacy-friendly browser. I use DuckDuckGo, which is a more privacy-friendly search engine. I use Signal. I use all of the appropriate ad blockers. I also try not to share a lot about my life. I don't upload images and stuff like that. But, you know, I think it's very individual and you can do whatever you feel is appropriate for you. I think, as my colleague here said, the problems here are systemic. So if we're going to do a step here or a step there, I think it matters less. But we need to think about more kind of systemic solutions. And obviously to try to think if we see that there are new services, to give them a chance, because, you know, we might find out that we like it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Now, does anyone in the audience have any questions?
My question is for James. If the Bright social media doesn't monetize data, what does it monetize? It's
a subscription model.
Okay.
So it's a standard. And I think it's a very important question, the way that you phrase it. So what's being productized? How are you commoditizing? And that's the sort of frame that exists around social media right now, which really doesn't make any sense. Why is it that I'm sharing a picture of my dog, the good dog, the older dog, the younger dog, I wouldn't share a picture of. Why, if I'm sharing a picture of my dog, does that automatically entitle the platform where I'm doing it to create a commoditizable or a productizable event out of that, right? But we've just accepted that because that's all that we've had for 20 years, right? But traditionally, the idea was if you want to have the engagement with other people, if you want to have a product that you like, you pay a service for it, and that's it. There are varying degrees of, you know, acknowledgement of, you know, how you would pay. Not everybody is in a position to pay, and there's a very complicated structure for making sure that it's open to as many people as humanly possible, especially students. But your point is, I think, a critical one across the board, which is why is this being turned into a product? That's the first question. And when we don't have an answer to that, we have an answer to that.
Cool, thank you. Any other questions?
I have a question that anyone can answer. I think based on your previous answers, I think I know what you're going to say, but like, are there any advantages to kind of having your data used? Like, not me myself, but I know like some people might like having personalized advertisements, might, you know, agree to proper consent and continue to if that sort of thing existed? And like, is there any ways that their data is being used that they may not know about that makes even in that case it not worth the cost? Or is it that, you know, there is a kind of group of people of which the Facebook model actually does work for?
I can have a go at answering that. So what's funny to me about this is like, so if the model is, you take my data, you figure out the things I might like, you target an ad to me to try and get me to buy those things. Like, presumably, if I buy the thing and I want it and I like it and I'm happy with the exchange of the money in the end, then like, yeah, maybe that's fine. But like, is the system of like gathering all my data, targeting me, putting a bid request out to hundreds of companies, them all bidding against each other to try and like get the opportunity to advertise the product to me, is that a good system of matching people's needs and wants with products and services that they need and want? Or is there a much better way of doing it? And is it, even if I get something good out of that exchange, does it make sense to make the like significant portion of my social relations with my family, my friends, my social relations with my community, my employer, mediated through these platforms? Is that a good idea, right? Because at the moment, it's not like there's an isolated place where I can go and see, okay, I'm now in the mood to be influenced about what I want to buy, and that's all it is. It's an infrastructure that's built on top of that does a whole load of other stuff and mediates my political relationships, my social relationships. And so that would be my answer, that like, even if there was some people for whom this was a good system of matching products and services with people who want them, the baggage it comes with is still probably, in my opinion, not worth it.
Thank you.
I think there's an important corollary point there too, which is that the entire structure of the system is based on the adoption of Thaler and Sunstein's nudge principle. And they call it the decisional matrix. But what they're really saying is, you want this product because you've been guided through what you've seen to want to choose one of these things. And a nudge, when grandma nudges you because you're not eating enough, carrots, that's a human decision based upon an understanding of you and based on care. When I show you 4 ads for tents from REI, and then you're like, God, I really want to go camping, that's not the same thing. And, so there's this, as Rubin's pointing out, there's this entire background that you're not seeing of, what goes into this decisional matrix. But there's also this other element to it, which is that real-time bidding, RTB, and the sort of micro-targeted approach is terrible for businesses. It is a terrible way for a business to advertise to you. I don't care if I'm a business, who cares what Jay Ward wants to go and buy tomorrow? What I want to know is, because I'm not going to advertise directly to you, it's inefficient. You might not want what I sell in 6 months. What I want to know is, what do people like Jay want to buy? What are people like this cohort interested in? And it's interesting, it's one of these times where reasonable business sense actually coincides with the more ethical approach to doing things. So when you have context-based advertising, like I searched for shoes 3 times today, so here's an ad for a shoe, that's much less invasive, much less intrusive, and in fact a lot more valuable to the companies that's doing the advertising than paying Google. Of all of all the money that we put into Google to do these ads, the click rate on Google Ads is 0.06, and half of those are misclicks, right? It's not a good system. It's wasting everyone's time and money. So if you go directly to the source, if I want to know, when is the pumpkin spice latte coming back? I cannot live another day without knowing when pumpkin spice latte is back. It's September 24th. It's always September 24th. Knowing the actual answer to that from the company that can give me that answer is far more valuable both to Starbucks and to me than the intermediated approach that Google has established. So that is a breakable
pressure point. That is a point where you can change the system and actually get something that is a phased de-escalation of the existing model. It can be done. You just have to be able to apply the pressure.
Thank you.
I just want to add one more thing because I think my colleagues here just contributed around ads, but it's important to realize that a lot of our experiences are also personalized. So if I have like a night that I'm like, maybe I just want to see an easy watching of a romantic film, that immediately turns all of my Netflix into romantic films. And it's quite illuminating because then I go to my partner's house and then when we're checking his Netflix, it's completely different. So when we're talking about these kind of ads, it's not only about ads, it's also about which kind of options are available to me, which kind of, content, which kind of art am I going to see and things like that. And I think that's really important because I don't always want to see just romantic films. I want to see action. I like anime, I like horror films. I like a lot of different films in different genres. And if these algorithms are creating this personalized experience according to my past, that means they're dictating what my future will be because they think that I'm this kind of one-sided person that only likes a specific kind of thing. So I think it's very important because it really shapes whatever kind of things I'm engaging with, right? Like you press one thing and then you just get that. I'm like, no, I just wanted that for one night because I was drinking a lot of gin and I was maybe a bit depressed. That doesn't mean I want it all the time. So I think the danger is this kind of algorithms that are shaping what is available to us on a lot of different types of levels. It also can be politics, it can be culture, it can be art, it can be a lot of different things.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So yeah, I recognize we're running over time. If anyone has any burning questions, feel free to ask. No? Okay, wonderful. Well, just wanted to say thank you so much to our panelists for coming to speak to us today. It's been really enlightening and I've really enjoyed listening to all you have to say. And I hope you had a good time speaking to us as well. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thanks, it was a pleasure.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you very much.
Great. Sure. So if you just...
You probably want to stop the recording.
Yeah, I'm going to free you from your video metaverse. So thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Great. It was so great. Thank you so much for inviting us.
Thank you. Yeah, it was really great. I loved hearing what you had to say. Thank you.
Thanks
Great questions.
Let me feel better.
Hopefully you both feel better.
Yeah, Rubin, I hope that you didn't catch it. And yeah, I'll
Fingers
see you
crossed.
at the metaverse. No, I'm kidding. On Twitter. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.